For those of you visiting, I'll go back on what the Common Good Cafe is. It's an attempt to establish an environment so that we can have a civic discussion. And this first part is a 7-week kind of experiment. We're kind of tweaking it and getting the, figuring out what we're doing, what works well, what doesn't work well. The format, if this is your first night here, is there is a presenter. The presenter speaks for about 20, 25 minutes. The presenter is supposed to have something to say that you can't say for yourself, and that's what makes the presenter a presenter, is they've got something to bring. Now, we will all evaluate and judge Tim Harris if he is in fact that person. And the magic of the night is after that. After that presentation, you're all broken up into, you self-organize into little pods of 3 or 5 folks, and you have a discussion about what you've just heard. And then we gather back together, and the Q&A comes back out of the groups, out of what you've discussed, again, with our presenter who's bringing us something that we can't bring here ourselves. And so that's kind of the format. It's an experiment in democracy. I think that's actually how democracy works, or at least that's one facet of how democracy works. There's a couple of additions that we hope will evolve, and eventually we get to a point where the culture here is civil, so that we can actually bring in opposing viewpoints. And so people can begin to really, truly dialogue with the cultural and political and economic problems of our times that seems to just be increasing. So one of the things that we've already learned is the power of music and the goodness of music and the soul of music. And so tonight we just have a wealth. Stanislav came and played for us a bit, and that was great. And then the legendary, yeah, Jim Page will also play. And so why don't we just kind of, give it up for Jim Page here.
Very glad to be here. I was here for the first one. I missed the second one. If this is the third, I'm here. If it's the fourth, I'm here too. The second here. I know that sounds weird, but I'm a guitar player. What can I say? Now, when I first came to Seattle, it was barely bigger than a small town, with the evergreen trees growing up and the good rain coming down. And it looked so innocent then. You'd never dreamed to take a glance at all those baby billionaires just waiting for their chance. Now a penny makes a nickel, makes a dime, makes a dollar, makes the kindergarten CEO want to jump up and holler, turns a software magician with a fine and friendly face into a planetary predator with his fingers all over the place. We used to call it Seattle, Jewel of the Puget Sound. We used to call it Seattle, now we call it Paul Allen Town. Now, Seattle was Duwamish, but that was in Indian affairs. So they turned him into a drinking fountain down at Pioneer Square. And the mountain was Tahoma, but that made their minds go blank. So they called it Rainier. And that became a bank, and the bank became a magnet for the money and the flash. And the mountain made of nature became a mountain made of cash. And the little baby billionaires broke out of their padded cells. And the little town got real big and everything went to hell. We used to call it Seattle, Jewel of the Puget Sound. We used to call it Seattle, now we call it Paul Allen Town. Now, Paul Allen made his first billions in the Microsoft days. Then he multiplied those billions and he gave himself a raise. And he gazed out into the distance as far as he could see. And everywhere he looked, he saw an opportunity, and he waved his wallet like a scepter and a sword. He said, there's nothing next to God that this wallet can't afford. Move over, Mr. Yesler. Step aside and take a bow. My name is Paul Allen. This is my town now. We used to call it Seattle, Jewel of the Puget Sound. We used to call it Seattle, now we call it Paul Allen Town. like sports? He'll build you a stadium or two. Yeah, and he'll do it with your money, too. He owns Lake Union. He owns the EMP. He owns half the city council, but he don't own me. You want to fondle your portfolio, you've come to the right place. You like high rise? Go get yourself a condo with a happy face, with a Starbucks on every corner, and your own cash machine. Now I know what they mean when they call it Evergreen. We used to call it Seattle. Jewel of the Puget Sound. We used to call it Seattle. Now we call it Paul Allen Town. Now, they say Paul Allen plays a mean guitar, but I don't think that's right. I think that poor guitar is just angry because he ain't treating it right. Like some adolescent ego with his billfold overblown. He thinks he can just go out and buy himself a rock star of his own. Jimi Hendrix on his bended knees up on Broadway on the bronze. He still can't figure out what went wrong. Playing the Star-Spangled Banner in a blown-out purple haze. Now he lives in a digital museum and his fans are all half crazed. We used to call it Seattle. Jewel of the Puget Sound. We used to call it Seattle. Now we call it Paul Allen Town. Big money likes to strut around just showing off its stuff. Yeah, we're all supposed to love it. We're not supposed to call its bluff. Just buy you a ticket, take your chance, and keep your place in line. And maybe they'll throw you down a few crumbs from time to time. Well, they say the road to hell is paved with all the best intentions. Hypnotized and dazzled by the latest slick inventions, like a deer in the headlights, trying to catch a ride. Well, it can be a big surprise when you reach the other side. We used to call it Seattle, Jewel of the Puget Sound. We used to call it Seattle, now we call it. We used to call it Seattle, Jewel of the Puget Sound. We used to call it Seattle, now we call it Paul Allen Town.
And now, for a Paul Allen wannabe, Tim Harris.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see so many people here. This was a good idea, Rich. I remember talking with Rich about this idea. And usually when we talk about things, we have these like huge, wild, grand ideas that don't come to anything. But thanks to Rich, this one did. Tonight I am going to talk about Occupy CEHKC, which is the organizing work that we're doing. And that's, Occupy CEHKC probably doesn't make a lot of sense to you right off the bat, but I'm hoping that by the time I stop talking, it will. And I want to draw some connections that might not already be totally obvious to you. And I want to talk about cities and sort of how cities have changed and how that's happened in relationship to homelessness. And I want to conclude by asking you all to consider the radical proposition that our sort of our public policy making around homelessness is pretty much just as corporate dominated as our public policy decision making in any other area of endeavor, and why that might be a problem. So to begin with, I want to start with Westlake Plaza. We had some recent experience with Westlake Plaza. We did our first sort of Occupy CEHKC demonstration, which was a 24-hour occupation of Westlake Center that culminated with about 100 to 150 of us marching to the CEHKC, that's the Committee to End Homelessness in King County Governing Board meeting, which happens quarterly, and asking them to develop an economic justice agenda. And part of the encampment at Westlake Plaza was that we had been told that we couldn't camp at Westlake Plaza, and we went to a federal judge and got a temporary restraining order that overturned the Parks Department decision to not allow us to camp overnight. And the judge agreed with us, and he overturned their decision, and we were allowed to camp overnight. And the reason that he overturned the decision was that he agreed with us that Westlake Plaza, Westlake Center, was a symbolic site. And I'll just read you a little bit from our motion. Usually, a legal motion doesn't contain the sort of language that makes your heart pitter-patter, but this is the exception. So I'm quoting here from plaintiff's emergency motion for temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction. To be clear, the plaintiffs were Real Change and Nicholsville and Share Wheel, and the defendants, you'll hear the word defendants in here, defendants were City of Seattle and Seattle Parks and Recreation. Defendants have engaged in a concerted effort over the past 15 years to sanitize the downtown business core around Westlake Park for the comfort of shoppers and tourists by pushing homeless populations to South Downtown through a number of tactics, including the now infamous panhandling ordinance passed by the City Council and backed by Seattle Downtown Association, the Seattle Convention, and visitors. This is actually a mistake. Our lawyer wrote this in a hurry. That the panhandling ordinance didn't pass. We defeated that. But they did pass the Sidron ordinance, so same diff. Passed by the City Council and backed by the Downtown Seattle Association, Seattle Convention and Visitors Bureau, the Monorail, Starbucks, the Mariners, and a host of other downtown interests. The proposed panhandling ordinance was only defeated by the mayor's veto after a significant public backlash. At the same time, the city has cut back on funding for emergency services, including closing homeless shelters. Second, plaintiffs intend to protest major downtown corporations and retailers in the immediate vicinity of Westlake Park, by and through purported community groups such as the Downtown Seattle Association. These corporations have participated in and profited from the defendants' efforts. The defendants, of course, you remember, is the City of Seattle, to sanitize the business core near Westlake Park. And in this spectacularly gratifying moment, a federal judge agreed with us and said that camping in Westlake Park was political free speech because of the symbolic nature of Westlake Park. And I want to talk more about that because Westlake is sort of ground zero of the remaking of Seattle. And as Seattle has been remade over the past several decades, there has been a consistent relationship to the oppression and repression of homeless people. And there's a reason for that. So just to sort of walk through that history, the development of Westlake Park was part of the Rhodes Project. And the Rhodes Project started in 1993. Jeff Rhodes, developer, had this great idea for how he could make the revitalization of the downtown work. And this was at a time when the downtown interests were very nervous about the sort of state of things, and they wanted to rebuild the downtown and bring commerce to the downtown. And they weren't clear on how they were going to do that. And you had the empty Frederick and Nielsen building that was a kind of an anchor store that people were freaked out about. And the roads project, it included buying the Frederick and Nielsen building, trading it off to the Nordstroms in a sort of an even trade, the city agreeing to build a 7-story parking garage. All in all, it was about $100 million in public subsidies, including a Section 108 HUD low-income housing loan that went to build this parking garage. About $100 million in public subsidies to attract what was estimated to be about $350 million in downtown development. And the Westlake Center and the closure of that center to traffic as sort of like, public space, and the making of that into commercial space was at the heart of that project. What a lot of people might not have put together is concurrently with the revitalization of Westlake and this huge sort of public subsidization of private development to remake the downtown, the Sidron ordinances were passed at the same time, and those were the sit-lie ordinances that said you can't crap up our public sidewalks by sitting down or laying down or meeting your human needs in public, which you have to do because you're homeless, and by definition you can't meet your human needs in private. So that was made illegal at that time, and we fought against that. A lot of people fought against it, but those fights are nearly always losing fights for reasons I'll go into later. But that was sort of, the opening gun of the downtown interests ongoing war on the poor. So we had the Sidron ordinances passed, we had the downtown revitalization. Quickly after that, we had the decision to build Benaroya Hall. And there was the Low Income Housing Institute had been approved to put an urban hygiene center, a downtown hygiene center, in the Glen Hotel, right around the corner from Benaroya Hall. Downtown interests completely freaked out. They're like, what? You're going to have smelly homeless people lining up half a block away from our new shiny Symphony Center? No way. And they went nuclear. They went nuclear, and they fought it with everything they had. And as a result of that, that service is not in the downtown core where it would really make sense for that to be. It's kind of off to the side. It's up around 9th and Stewart, and it's a sort of a significant extra leg to the trips that people need to make to get clean. And that's becoming more problematic now because of the demise of the ride-free zone, which is, another instance of how when we decide that we can't afford things, it's nearly always the dirt poor that we can't afford. So after that fight went on for like 2 years, and we ultimately lost that. So then, continuing to link the history of downtown development and how we treat homeless people, we had the condo gold rush that really peaked, right? I mean, the developers here were about a year late out of the gate because the subprime mortgage industry and the credit industry pretty much collapsed right in the middle of their condo boom, and that put a bit of a crimp in their plans. But nonetheless, this was another opportunity to oppress homeless people. There was the starting gun was that there had been a 600-foot limit on high-rise condos in the downtown area. And legislation was passed that said you could build over 600 feet and you have to pay this sort of bonus that goes into open space and the development of low-income housing. But the 600-foot cap on downtown residential is off. You can do this now. So, we fought this fight around there, which, was a Pyrrhic victory in hindsight, where working with Puget Sound Sage, we were able to raise the amount that developers paid into that amount from a proposed $10 a square foot to $20 a square foot. And the developers during this fight, lined up to say, you're making it impossible for us to do business. You make us do this, we're going to have to take our precious development capital and go to Bellevue where they appreciate it. Your beautiful skyline is going to be wasted. And the city council called them on their bluff. It was actually impressive. They don't usually do that. And they doubled the TDR bonus, and it didn't prevent a single developer from rushing down to City Hall to try to be first to get their permits filed. And there was this period where you literally could not get a construction crane west of the Mississippi because you'd look at the Seattle skyline and they were all over the place. You couldn't swing a dead cat in the downtown without hitting a construction crane. Well, oddly, during this period was when the mayor's office, Greg Nichols, decided to secretly engage in a policy shift from tolerance of homeless encampments and a sort of a complaint-driven system for monitoring and sometimes clearing homeless encampments to a proactive, zero-tolerance stance towards homeless encampments. And that meant systematically identifying where people were camping and sending crews out on a monthly basis to proactively clear those encampments. And at first they did it without any protocols whatsoever and without notifying anybody they were going to do it. They just sent out teams. They would take machetes to people's tents. They would throw all their crap in a dumpster, and they would threaten to arrest them if they came back to say anything about it. It was just brutal. And it took us weeks to get them to even admit that they were doing it. And we finally, through a Freedom of Information request, found an email that gave evidence that there had actually been a policy shift to a zero-tolerance policy. And we spent the next 2 years fighting them over the encampment clearance protocol. And the Nichols administration just sort of stonewalled us through that entire period, refused to meet with us, and engaged in negotiations in extremely bad faith. It was the most one-sided public hearing I have ever attended when they had their public hearing on the encampment protocols, where we turned out 76 people to testify, and there was one person who sort of half-heartedly testified in favor of the protocols that they had proposed. And after that hearing, they really did not change their proposed protocols at all. They just, it was a unusually farcical public process in a city known for its farcical public processes. So you had that relationship between downtown development boom, repression of homeless people. So then you've got, the collapse of the subprime mortgage industry, and you've got the collapse of the credit market with it, and suddenly all of these developers who have buildings half built are in big trouble because nobody's buying, and people are trying to bail on the contracts that they'd signed to move into units that were going to be built because the prices are really inflated. The market's just crashed, and people have been paying these pre-crash prices for luxury condos. So everybody's backing out, and developers are going bankrupt, literally going bankrupt. And you've got 20 to 25% downtown vacancy rates in office space and retail as a result of the recession. That's the kind of thing that just reaches deep into the intestines of the Downtown Seattle Association and closes with an icy grip and starts to squeeze, and they're like, oh God, I feel bad, what do I do? I know, I'm going to blame homeless people. And that is when they tried to get the anti-panhandling legislation across, because obviously the problems of the downtown have not been caused by the collapse of the credit industry and the subsequent decimation of small businesses and that sort of thing. It is the homeless people that are scaring people away from shopping downtown. And, you know, amazingly, we were able to stop that legislation from passing. And frankly, we just got lucky. We got really, really lucky. The Seattle Human Rights Commission came out with a report that totally panned this legislation and said that it was creating a type of discretion at the beat cop level that was going to lead to the criminalization of very poor people and lead to increased incarceration and a sort of a kind of what's the word that I'm after? A kind of profiling, a kind of an economic profiling that targets poor people, people of color, gives the cops a lot of discretion in who they can arrest for like bullshit reasons that don't really stand up, and that these were going to create barriers to people who were already very hard pressed for survival. It was going to make it even harder for them by creating a whole raft of new problems. Well, the city council was fully prepared to ignore that news. You know, that report landed with just, you know, I mean, nobody even noticed it. Sally Clark was doing her thing where she always kind of pretends to very carefully consider the various ethical implications of the legislation before she votes with the downtown interests, you know, 100% of the time. And she was wearing her sincere face and going through that thing. And we decided that the Seattle Human Rights Commission, I mean, they're sort of a quasi-governmental body. They couldn't politicize their own report, but we could do that. So we worked with the NAACP, the ACLU. We had a press conference with them and Nick Licata. We got some traction. We flipped Harrell. We flipped Rasmussen. We already had Licata. And then, you know, this mayor, this new populist mayor who'd kind of like come on in this sort of wave of populist backlash, who owed absolutely nothing to the downtown interest because they backed the other guy. He decided that you know, the time was right for him to step up and veto, and we did this pressure campaign on O'Brien, you know, as sort of, you know, the body snatchers had gotten to O'Brien, you know, and it was sort of like his come to Jesus moment. And, you know, he thankfully for his soul, he rejoined us. And we won on that, which was freaky. And the downtown establishment completely flipped out. They went nuts. The press in the aftermath of that was just toxic and rabid. You know, they could not believe that the city was capable of such an act of compassion. It really freaked them out. So that is a pretty astonishing history when you think about it, and it's kind of going on under our noses. There is this direct relationship between downtown development and the needs of sort of downtown corporations. And when the panhandling legislation was up before the city council and people were testifying, I mean, it was like a who's who of corporate Seattle, you know. It was like, the Mariners? Really? The Mariners are here testifying against panhandlers? You know, it's like, what, is Apple Pie going to come up and testify next, you know? It was like Starbucks. It was Tillamook Village. It was Argosy Cruises. It was the monorail. It was Seattle Center, Seattle Convention and Visitors Bureau, Master Builders Association, all of the chambers of commerces, you know, and of course the Downtown Seattle Association, and they were frantic to get this thing passed. So what's going on there is that there is this, cities have changed. Cities are not what they were 30 or 40 years ago. You know, modern homelessness, and I think of modern homelessness as the homelessness that we've had from the 70s forward, because we had pretty much eliminated homelessness in this country. Homelessness, I talked to a kid who was like 19 the other day, and as often happens when I have these conversations with people of that age, you know, he was like, what, really? Homelessness hasn't always been here? You know, I mean, that's news to people who have grown up with it. But, you know, there was a period of homelessness that dated from sort of post-Civil War demobilization and the imposition of the factory labor system, major economic disruption. It sort of flipped the relationship between the urban and the countryside, and suddenly you had this huge economic disruption. You had lots of migrant labor and, you know, what we think of as hobos, and that lasted up until World War II. But World War II created full employment. And there was a decision that was made, a series of decisions, that with the war demobilization, we weren't going to do the same thing that we did with Civil War demobilization. We weren't going to like release people to go to hobo camps, you know. And my theory is that, you know, it's because you've just like trained all of these people in the use of explosives and small arms. So that's a bad idea. You know, so instead they did the GI Bill, which is probably the greatest engine of class mobility this country's ever seen. You know, FHA guaranteed loans, programs that put people to work building bridges, infrastructure, that kind of thing. And you had this agreement, you know, that the public sector and the private sector was going to work together toward the common good, and that lasted for, you know, about 3 decades or so, and you had steady, moderate economic growth and this continuous decline in inequality up until about 73. And then you had the whole thing come undone, you know, because really globalization, the invention of the shipping container and you know, the internet, making it possible to be able to ship goods and not incur big losses and be able to locate pretty much anywhere. And that was kind of, you know, the opening gun of the attack on the agreement that we had and the beginning of 4 decades of increasing inequality. Well, part of that was the loss of the manufacturing base, which was devastating for cities, you know, because they had to remake themselves, you know. Nobody wanted to be Detroit. Nobody wanted to be that boarded up city that's lost 20 to 25% of their population and is an economic basket case. So, you know, how do cities reinvent themselves? Well, cities reinvent themselves as centers of urban living, as centers of upscale consumption for those who can afford it, you know, and there's a kind of a formula that goes along with that. You have the sort of like shiny shopping centers, you've got the kind of, you know, the yuppie cuisine, you know, and you've got the Starbucks, you've got the cultural amenities, you know. It helps if you're surrounded by a beautiful landscape. You want to put up, you know, numerous stadia. And Seattle followed that script, you know, and we pursued it very, very aggressively. But there's an issue within that, because while cities are, you know, an awesome place for people to experience the joys of urban living and density, when they can afford it, they're also the centers that have the tax base to be able to provide services for poor people. And you've got 40 years of widening inequality, you know. That is a lot of poor people. Just here in Seattle, between 2009 and 2010, the poverty rate went up from 10%, the numbers of people living below the poverty line went from 10 to 14%. That's in a single year, you know. That's astonishing. So you've got all of these poor people, and they are living in the urban centers too, cheek by jowl with the yuppies. So what do? You know? Well, what you do is what cities everywhere have done. They adopt a 10-year plan and a committee to manage the contradiction, which is, I think, essentially what the Committee to End Homelessness in King County is. You know, the 10-year plan to end homelessness is, you know, not a particularly unique thing. It came out of the Bush administration. I mean, here's a question everybody ought to consider. You know, it's kind of like a Zen koan. You know, it's like the sound of one hand clapping. And if you get the answer to this, you'll have this kind of aha moment and break through to enlightenment. You know, why would the Bush administration, probably the most hostile administration to the interests of poor people in recent history, be the administration to commit themselves to ending homelessness within 10 years? You know? It's befuddling, isn't it? Well, here's the thing. It's not a commitment to ending homelessness at all. It is an ideology. It's not a plan. It's an ideology. And government is the mechanism through which this ideology is propagated. And the ideology is that homelessness is not a matter of system failure. It's not about system failure. It's about individual failure. It's not about a screwed up system. It's about screwed up people. Not about how we can fix the system. It's about how we can fix Joe homeless guy and make things okay for him. It's very, very inward looking. And it's really about, it narrows homelessness to really looking at housing and service provision. Housing and service provision. And of course there's the lip service, you know, that says, well, of course, we all know jobs, housing, blah, blah, blah. But there's no program around that. There's no advocacy, there's no action, there's no grassroots mobilization. Government is the wrong actor to take on the task of ending homelessness, because government is like fatally compromised, you know? Government is on sort of the horns of dilemma, because you can't ignore homelessness, because to ignore homelessness would be to be, you know, considered unjust and callous. But you can't really do anything about homelessness either, because to do something about homelessness would be to engage in fixing all of those sort of vexing wage labor relationships that are out there, that you would stop getting campaign contributions if you did that. So what does government do? Government makes a big show of pretending to end homelessness, of working really, really hard on ending homelessness and setting goals and having these data points, you know, and making a sort of a big, you know, I think of it as like a fat guy running. There's a lot of huffing and puffing and sweating, but there isn't a lot of forward motion. And the thing is that when the 10-year plan was adopted, that was in, well, the first year was 2005. The first full year of the plan was 2006. The first year, from 2006 to 2012, we've been doing these one-night counts every year. And I'm about to wrap up. I see you over there. So we've been doing these one-night counts every year, from 2006 to 2012. Well, from 2006 to 2012, there has been a 33% increase in the number of people counted after the shelters are filled countywide. And in Seattle, and one can say, you know, they've added new count areas countywide. That's apples to oranges, you know. It's not really a 33% increase. And that would be true. But if you look at Seattle alone, you know, and maybe there's been some improvements in how they conduct the count in Seattle alone, but Seattle alone is a 17% increase since the 10-year plan started to people who are outside. And there's been a 7% increase between 2006 and 2011, which is the last year we have numbers for, of people actually in shelter that night. So by any measure, we're losing. But you know what the official line of the CEHKC is, the Committee to End Homelessness? We're winning. We're winning. And there's roughly a 4% reduction in homelessness every year due to the efforts of the 10-year plan to end homelessness, which is just not true. It's just not true. So CEHKC has been AWOL on all of the civil rights issues that have conflicted with downtown development. You know, the zero tolerance policy on urban camping, AWOL, not there. the panhandling stuff. Not there. Don't have a thing to say about it. And the reason that we've initiated this Occupy CEHKC organizing project is that, just like we know that our financial regulations are written by the corporations. We know that our insurance regulations are written by the corporations. We know that our healthcare regulations are written by the corporations. Housing, Freddie Mac and Sallie Mae are some of the worst, or not Sallie Mae, Freddie Mac and Freddie Mae are some of the worst actors out there. So we know who's writing the housing policy. Is it such a radical idea to consider that corporations and business interests that own government are writing our policy on how we're going to end homelessness as well? So this is why we have gone to the Committee to End Homelessness in King County, and we've asked them 3 things. We have said that A, you have to stop using data as a weapon. You can't use that as an excuse to defund grassroots homeless organizations that are providing emergency shelter cost effectively and in an empowering way, which is exactly what they're about to do to Share Wheel, because Share Wheel doesn't have the capacity to participate in their Safe Harbors data collection system. So they're about to defund them, which is, quite convenient for them. We're also saying that you have to listen to what homeless people say they need. And what homeless people are saying that they need is, we have a crisis out here. We're living out on the street. There's not enough shelter for us. The shelters are packed. It's got bed bugs, lice. The conditions suck. Please do something about that. What's the official response? We're going to withdraw money in a couple of years from the emergency shelter system to put it into housing, because in our magical world, where if you put money into housing, you will be able to commensurately withdraw money from shelter, that's how we think it's going to work. And we're also saying that you have to develop an economic justice agenda to end homelessness and actively pursue it, because all of the stuff that you're doing is completely getting trumped by broader social forces, and you can't continue to approach homelessness as though it's caused by this sort of, apolitical set of circumstances and has nothing to do with the broader economic picture. Not when you are claiming the mantle of being the organization that speaks for homeless people and homeless advocates and sets the agenda for homeless advocacy in this city. So that's our organizing project, and I've gone at least 10 minutes over, so I'm going to shut up.
But he has spoken longer than anyone else, and you've spoken for, 20, almost 33 minutes. Wait a minute. And I didn't hear one F-bomb. Anybody hear an F-bomb? That's amazing.
I'm trying to be better.
Fantastic job.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to manage detail, because it's a very detailed document, and I could spend the next 15 minutes, talking about it. But the basic logic of the 10-year plan is based on the idea of housing first. And it's the idea that it is both cheaper and more humane to put somebody in housing with supportive services than to have them cycling through jails, emergency rooms, and that sort of thing, not having their needs met. And that when you have people who are chronically homeless, there's a definition of chronic homelessness that's quite detailed, but the basic idea is a long-term homeless person who has multiple issues that's keeping them on the street. It's going to be better to get them into housing immediately with services. And the logic is that if you focus on doing that, that there is a finite number of chronically homeless people who need a finite amount of housing. So if you identify, I'm just going to pull numbers out of my butt like they do, If you identify 300,000 people that are chronically homeless across the country, then if you build 30,000 units of affordable housing with services a year across the country, you're going to get all of those people in. You're going to take a lot of pressure off of the emergency shelter system because the sort of like the frequent flyers are removed from the system, which allows you to focus your resources on the people that you can help with less energy. And therefore, by this process of narrowing it down, helping the chronic homeless first, and then as you gain capacity, shrinking down the shelter system, and after 10 years, everybody who needs it's in housing, and you've ended homelessness. That's kind of the basic theory. That's the basic theory. It's a simplified version, but the problem with that is that it's a logic of a closed system. You have this fixed number of homeless people, this fixed number of economically devastated people. You've got, look at what just happened in D.C., for the budget deal with super committee, where the House Republicans reneged on their deal to cut military spending because they couldn't reach an agreement, and they said, hey, let's gut food stamps and programs for abused kids and Meals on Wheels and basic health care for poor people instead. So you got that kind of crap going on. This 10-year plan paradigm isn't going to be able to keep up. And the other thing is that they track the affordable housing that they build to meet the 10-year plan goals, but they don't track the affordable housing that attrits off the market through just gentrification and market pressures, which is significant. It's at least twice as much housing as they're able to build that we're losing, and that's kind of the flaw in the paradigm. Is it's not a closed system. It's this artificial logic. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but I did my best to be pithy. Right there. Well, the question is it a good strategy to, do things like run the 1098 initiative until we actually, have passed it and have something resembling a fair tax system? And I would say, yeah, that's a great idea. To my mind, the core issues that need to be fixed have to do with, corporate personhood and what that means in terms of outsized political influence in the democratic process and corporate rights trumping community rights over and over again. Campaign finance reform, getting the money out of politics because, again, we have a really broken system. And tax reform, without those things, those are sort of, the fundamental things that we have to do before we can reasonably fix things, because that's why the political system's broken, and you can't just reform a fundamentally broken system. You got to deal with why it's broken, right? Yeah. Back there. So you're talking about the King County proposal to have a small hike in the sales tax to fund human services. My position at the time, and it really hasn't changed, is yes, that's a regressive tax, and we need human services. And if you can't pass a regressive tax, and people are going to need to pay another fraction of a penny on a purchase, that's a better solution than no solution. I'm not one to let excellent get in the way of good, and sometimes being paralyzed by the perfect solution is worse than not doing anything. Yeah. The most fundamental thing that I would do differently if I were running the committee to end homelessness is I would have a grassroots strategy. I would be talking about economic justice as the solution to homelessness, and about how we're not going to end homelessness unless we approach it at that level. I would be tapping into the moral outrage that people rightly feel about homelessness instead of trying to neutralize it with these sort of bland assertions that we're doing fine, everything's okay, don't worry about it, we've got our committee, they're doing our work, we're going to Olympia, we're making our case, they're giving us everything they possibly can up to the point where it actually challenges anything fundamental or offends anybody who actually has any power. I think that if you don't do grassroots mobilization, if you're not building power, if you're not building momentum to be able to challenge the folks who want to keep things the way they are, what you get is, maybe this year they're not going to cut the housing trust fund, and you call that a big victory because you haven't lost more ground. So I think, focus on the big picture, enlist allies, build a movement, use the moral outrage instead of going out of your way to neutralize it and put people back to sleep. So the statement is that the system will respond when we start disrupting it and forcing it to respond. And I agree with that. Peter Marcuse is a sort of a urban sociologist, been around a long time. He wrote an essay called Neutralizing Homelessness, which is seminal. All of the literature that deals with globalization as the kind of precipitating event that created modern homelessness, cites his essay published in 1983 in Socialist Review as kind of the academic source of the beginning of that kind of analysis. And one of the things that he talks about, and he's sort of borrowing from Piven and Cloward here, is that there are two circumstances when the system will take care of poor people. One is when poor people's labor will again be needed, when their labor power is essentially in abeyance. There's a cyclical downturn, a bunch of people who are unemployed, they're going to be needed again. So, in those circumstances, you have a relatively generous welfare state, that maintains people until they're back in the labor force. That's not the situation we're in. The situation we're in is we've got a whole bunch of people that have been written off and are superfluous to the economy, and unless things change pretty radically, they're not working again. They've been thrown to the wolves. So the other circumstance is when there is a system threat, when people are out in the streets protesting, when people are raising hell. And when you look at the history of 20th century poor people's movements, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, welfare rights movement, it's Piven and Cloward wrote about this in Poor People's Movements. It's pretty clear that what gets results is when people are out in the streets raising hell, and there has to be a system response.
Occupying foreclosed homes or occupying vacant apartments.
Right.
Well, let's give them some love. Next week, Dr. Cynthia Molobido will be with us, and her talk isn't a spirituality of economy; it's a spirituality of resistance. And I think what she wants to do is take us into the moral question of what can we do, and what kind of people are we becoming. So, Jim, why don't you sing us out?
If I could face the day the way the sunlight does, if I could rise with the morning mist, then I would know the way that the water fish swims, I could hold the lessons in my fist. We are dying, say the elders, and we don't even know this is only a temporary peace. We're only waiting for the outcome to show and the endings to be released. behind the silence of a great stone wall, the howling of a new wilderness, beyond the distance of a great stone wall. It will change, it will change. It wasn't always like this. I've been to places where the clocks don't tick and they laugh at the hard straight line, where history looks through a baby's eyes and the light of the future is a good sign. Some laws are made of barbed wire and they lean to the privileged few, but reality shoots from behind a blade of grass and its aim is true. Behind the silence of a great stone wall, the howling of a new wilderness, beyond the distance of a great stone wall. It will change, it will change. It wasn't always like this. Well, there's a warfare fought in the bloodstream now, and truth is a thing to be praised. The lie gets mean and it hides in the marrow and it waits for the stakes to be raised. And the dry rattle breath of the exit time is a wake-up call to your ear. But the feel of a fist at the end of your arm is the answer to your tears. Behind the silence of a great stone wall, the howling of a new wilderness, beyond the distance of a great stone wall. It will change, it will change. It wasn't always like this. Well, they tell me that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and sometimes I think I see. Like the dissident glint in the eye of a needle or the glitter of a soul set free. There's a song that they sing in the worst of times to lift your spirit in the wings and fly. Way on the other side of that storm cloud wall, dancing in a clear blue sky. Behind the silence of a great stone wall, the howling of a new wilderness, beyond the distance of a great stone wall. It will change, it will change. It wasn't always like this.